How do I read the book of 1 Corinthians? Corinthians is a letter to a church with problems, some big ones. And because of that, we can find a huge amount in it to help us with things we should be doing and things we should avoid at all cost. Who wrote this letter? It was the Apostle Paul, with the assistance of Sosthenes, who transcribed for him. Not much is known about Sosthenes. Someone with the same name is mentioned in Acts 18, a ruler of the synagogue, who was beaten up for not denouncing Paul. Who is it written to? It is written to the church in Corinth that Paul had planted a few years previous, before he'd moved on to Ephesus. Corinth was a strategic city. Paul plants churches in port cities with strong networks, as this helps the spread of the gospel. Corinth is one such city, built on the Isthmus of Corinth, which is the narrow land bridge that connects the Peloponnese Peninsula with the rest of mainland Greece. It was just 6.3 kilometres wide, and it was used as a shortcut for trade. Boats could be moved across the land on a stone ramp called the Diolkos. In 1893, a canal was built to achieve the same objective. In other words, many people came through this place. It was an ideal location to reach out from. However, it was also a very pagan city. The huge temple of Aphrodite housed 2,000 priestesses who were effectively prostitutes. Indeed, to Corinthianize became a verb in the Greek language, meaning to have promiscuous sex. So this background explains in part why Paul needed to concentrate on the issue of sex and relationships in his letters to this church. While in Ephesus, Paul learns of serious problems in the Corinthian congregation and writes a long letter to address those issues. When was this letter written? We know this letter was written by Paul while he was in Ephesus before the Feast of Pentecost, which was in the spring. We know this because he tells us as much in the letter. 1 Corinthians 16:8, "But I will stay in Ephesus until Pentecost." Paul was in Ephesus for 3 years, and this was written near the end of his final year there. Paul was in Corinth around 50 AD and stayed until around 52 AD. He then moved on to Ephesus, so his time there was nearing an end around 54 to 55 AD. So that's when this letter was written. Before we go into details, how could we describe this book in one sentence? Paul tackles sin and problems in the church at Corinth. Why did he write this book, and how can we understand it? This is actually the second of 4 letters Paul wrote to this church. In 1 Corinthians 5:9, Paul references a previous letter, but one that has not survived. There are also references in 2 Corinthians to a third letter, also lost, but we will deal with that one next time. This is the first of the remaining 2, but the second overall. It's not knowing what was contained in this first letter or why it was written, but due to the context of its mention here, one of the things it dealt with was sexual immorality, a persistent problem in the church in Corinth. Sometime later, Paul received a report indicating the Corinthians had not only misunderstood his first letter, but were also plagued with serious problems of division, sexual immorality, and social snobbery. Around the same time, a letter arrived from the Corinthians displaying theological confusion and asking him questions. As a result of both these things, Paul writes this letter to deal with them. The culture of Corinth had been creeping into the church and it needed addressing. As a result, we can learn a great many lessons from this book. But we must remember when we do so, this is a letter to a specific people in a specific time and place. Whilst we can learn a lot, we need to be careful how we apply this in a very different culture and context. We can break this letter down into 7 sections. Number 1, greetings and an introduction to the main themes. Number 2, dealing with divisions over following preachers. Paul is very keen for them to understand they should be of one mind. Corinth had had its head turned by teachers such as the gifted Apollos and the Apostle Peter, and had started to compare them to Paul, not in Paul's favour. It's interesting that Paul and Apollos are connected at the time of writing, and Apollos doesn't seem keen at all to return to Corinth. This was a young church, and Paul had now been absent from them for longer than he'd been with them. They felt unsettled in regard to Paul's role as their father in the gospel. It also seems that local leaders had arisen in the past 2 or 3 years and were taking pride in their eloquence and objecting to Paul's ongoing oversight from a distance. Paul addresses all of this. Number 3, dealing with the reports over sexual immorality and lawsuits against each other. Paul is appalled at some of the reports he's getting that one man was involved with an immoral relationship with his stepmother, or possibly even his actual mother. That's the kind of thing even pagans said was wrong. Yet no church discipline had been applied here at all. And Paul's solution is right to the point. Get that man away from the church. In 1 Corinthians 6 verses 9 to 10, Paul lists the sort of sins that were part of the Corinthian believers' former way of life. They had been sexually immoral, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, homosexual offenders, thieves, greedy, drunkards, slanderers, swindlers. This list was never meant to be an all-inclusive list of sins. These were just the ones that were a problem in Corinth as a city, and sadly, still a problem in the church. He also calls out the behaviour of those in the church suing each other. He points out the futility of getting the world to come in and judge the church. Number 4, issues the Corinthian church asked about because they were confused on them. This includes marriage and singleness, food offered to idols. He rebukes those who are attacking his apostleship, and then he tackles idolatry in itself. Number 5, divisions over corporate worship. This includes head coverings, communion, spiritual gifts and their usage, unity of the church body, the need for love, using tongues and prophecy in an orderly way, keeping a sense of order in corporate worship times. He attacks the way they've let the world into the church. They'd even let gluttony and drunkenness come into their times of communion. Paul says taking it in such an unworthy manner brings judgment upon yourself, telling them that they'd brought sickness and even death to them. He reminds them it's a time to remember Jesus and to examine ourselves. Number 6, the importance of the resurrection. He challenges skepticism that had emerged, not just the resurrection of Jesus, but that we will all be raised. He says if there's no resurrection, then Christians are pretty pitiful. And number 7, housekeeping and practical matters such as taking an offering for those in need, his future travel plans and greetings from people who were with him. Many Christians imagine that the Christian life would be better if only we could recover the conditions of a previous era. Maybe the Welsh revival of 1904 or the Methodist revival, or if we only could have lived through those times. Perhaps the most popular choice is the days of the New Testament. If only we could return to those times, all would be well. But this letter shows that the church of the New Testament times had problems too, often very similar ones to what we have to deal with today. This was a church on the cusp of destroying itself, even though it was prominent and strategic. The early church was not perfect. It must have been tempting to write this church off, but Paul did not. He wrote to them and visited them in the hope that they would see their errors. The 2 biggest battles for any church concern how to keep the church in the world, in other words, evangelism, and how to keep the world out of the church, in other words, holiness. Most problems can be put under one of these two headings, and it was especially true of the Corinthian church. Church may be messy, it may make mistakes, but there is no perfect church, and we must continually look to keep the church holy.